Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 15 on warfare through time. And we're still in the industrial era, ladies and gentlemen. We're still looking at the nature of warfare, and we're looking at armies. Now this is part 2. Previous video I looked at the armies from 1700 to 1850. This particular video I'm looking more from 1850 to 1900. This idea of the rate of change, the pace of change increasing from 1850 through to 1900, 50 years of change. And hopefully what this video will try to show you, number one, what the changes actually were, and secondly, just as important, why did things change so quickly? What factors, what reasons, what causes were there influencing the pace of change? Now, first, the size of the army. Remember, previous video I said for about 100, 150 years, apart from times of war, the army was pretty constant, on average about 50,000 men. Finally, we begin to see a huge increase. 1838, the army's 88,000. 1849, the army's 115,000. 1869, it's 135,000. And finally, 1899, just before the end of this particular section of the course, the army is 250,000. We have seen a huge increase, ladies and gentlemen. The size of the army had increased. Reason for that? The growth of the British Empire. Put simply, more soldiers were needed in more countries throughout the world, which were part of the British Empire. They had to go to those countries and do some duties, whether fighting or keeping the peace. Therefore, the government realized they needed to organize and increase the size of the army, and that would also mean organizing and increasing the cost, finances, taxation. So one major change is size of army. That was a change from 1850. Now, let's move on to the composition of the army. In other words, what type of soldiers were there? And here we get a bit of continuity. Things pretty much stayed the same. There's no real rapid change here. We still had infantry and we still had cavalry. 1854, the start of the Crimean War. The British Army, 5 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division. 1914, key year. You know why? Start of World War I, First World War. 1914, the British Army, 4 infantry divisions, 2 cavalry divisions. In other words, things were pretty much the same. We have here some continuity. Now, let's move on. What about tactics? Tactics. Now then, let's have a look. Video 13. Go back and check it if you've forgotten. Technology had improved weapons massively, such as rifles, machine guns. This had a big impact, ladies and gentlemen, on the importance, the need, the power of defence. Infantry and cavalry. Therefore, charges by infantry and charges by the cavalry surely were no longer possible, because it would lead to huge losses because of the increase in the rapid rate of fire and also an increase in the range of fire, the distance. So you would think that would bring about a complete and utter end to the charge. But, ladies and gentlemen, there is always a but in history. It's unbelievable. The generals of these armies from 1850 onwards were very, very slow to learn this lesson. up to the 1900s and beyond. In other words, even into the First World War. Unbelievably, charges, direct head-on charges towards the enemy was still a thing. Now, in World War I, it's very, very controversial. I'm going to show you a couple of books. Look at the title of this one. The Donkeys. Now, the donkeys aren't the soldiers. This author here, Alan Clark, is saying that soldiers were very brave, lions. But they have been sent to charge, look, by their generals. It's the generals who he said were the donkeys because they haven't learned this lesson, that a full charge straight on at the front isn't really a good idea. Here's another one from the First World War. Look at the title of this one. British Butchers and Bunglers of World War I. Again, it's not the soldiers, it's their generals. Now, this particular Australian historian, a man called John Laffin, very critical of the generals, saying that they have not learned the lesson going back to 1850. Really, the charge should have been wiped out because of the change in weapons, but for a variety of reasons it wasn't. Now, get back to the period we're studying, the industrial era. 1854, the Battle at Alma. The British infantry easily defeated a far larger force of Russian soldiers. Why? Because the British rifles, with their groove barrels, that meant that the soldiers had the rifles with the groove barrels. They could fire over far longer range than the Russians, who still had the smooth bored muskets. So therefore, because they've got better weaponry, they will win, even though they're outnumbered. Same year, 1854, Battle of Inkerman, still in the Crimean War. A British force of 7,500 successfully fought off a Russian force of 25,000. They're outnumbered 3-1, but they still win. The British lost about 2,000 and the Russians lost 11,000. Why? Because the British had the Minié rifles, which gave them a greater range. I mentioned the Minié bullets in a previous video. Go back and check it, video 13. So we see technology is beginning to alter the weapons, and that should alter the tactics. But remember that thing that I've said. It was a decision that the generals were very, very slow to take. It was a lesson they were very slow to learn. Now, what about cavalry? Now, 1971. David Bowie, the late, great David Bowie. Turn and face the strange changes. Changes. Great song, ladies and gentlemen. Go and look it up. Now, you would think that these new developments in weapons would lead to the decline of the cavalry. 1850. Surely the charge by the cavalry, headlong, full attack from the front as a shock attack, that is not really a useful or a successful tactic anymore. At the Battle of Balaclava, and I'll do a video on that in the future, the British cavalry, the charge of the Light Brigade, showed that it was not really a very successful tactic. It was very brave, but it surely was not a successful tactic any longer. But, there it is again, but the cavalry still remained a very important part of the British Army. Why? Well, here's two reasons. One, fair enough, they had other roles that they could do. They could do scouting, they could do skirmishing, they could do raiding. Fair enough, they are proper tactics. But secondly, it's that thing that I've mentioned before in the previous video, social attitudes, the attitudes of people in society and people in charge in society. The army was very traditional. The army was very conservative with a small c, not really wanting to embrace change very much. Many of the people right at the top of the army had been in the cavalry, and therefore they felt almost emotionally attached to the army, to the cavalry in the army, and they did not want to get rid of something that they'd grown up with. Now, as Mr. Spock would have said on Star Trek, "That's illogical, Captain." Yes, it was illogical, but they couldn't rid themselves of it. They were emotionally tied to the cavalry, so the cavalry continued a role in the British Army when maybe its time should have gone because of the developments of technology. Now, next thing, strategy. What happened as regards strategy? Well, we are talking change. The government decides to change strategy. Remember at the start of the video, they want and needed a far larger army, which needed money to pay for it. The size of the army increases, the cost of the army increases. Technology gets better, so now they've got new weapons. Large armies, modern weapons, cost. But the government decided it was necessary. Next factor which influences strategy. The British Empire. Remember I said the British Empire, huge all over the world. One of the reasons why Britain needed a larger army. Army strategists were working out and realizing that they needed to use their army to operate far further away from Britain for longer periods as well. Two developments helped because of the Industrial Revolution. Two developments helped this to happen. One, transport. Two, communications. Well, let's start with transport. Now, transport by land. Well, if you are a soldier, infantry, and you are marching across a country to get to another country to fight, well, how would you rather get there? Actual marching or go by train? Go by rail, steam power, Industrial Revolution, steam engine, trains. That meant that transport was quicker, more reliable, 15 times faster than just a marching army. The army would arrive fresher, not tired. If you are taking your supplies by wagon across land, well, a wagon train of supplies, 10 miles a day. The early trains, steam-powered trains, 20 miles per hour. Can you see that this will be a huge change, an improvement in transport? The British Army actually had the first ever military railway going from the town of Balaclava to the front line, just bringing their only military stuff was used on that particular part of the track. 260 tons of food or supplies per day could be provided on that track. Can we see that things were changing? Transport was getting better, and this would have an impact on the armies. What about sea transport? The British Empire across the globe. Therefore, sea transport, the Navy, would be very, very important. Now, England, Britain had always had a fantastic navy going back into history. Think of the Spanish Armada, 1588. It was important to have a strong navy. Now, most of the navy, of course, the form of travel was sailing ships. But when we get to the Industrial Revolution and when we get the steam engine, new steamships were developed. They were quicker. They were more reliable. They will work when there's no wind, unlike the sailing ship. Companies get involved because they see a profit. The Cunard Line. 11 steamships moved men, soldiers, weapons, supplies to the Crimea for the Crimean War in 3 weeks. That's a huge improvement, a huge development. So transport is beginning to have an impact on the nature of the armies. They can be further away and they can be larger because they can be supplied. The next thing, communication. Now, 1983, Spandau Ballet, one of my favourite bands at the time. Communication let me down and I'm left here. Well, communication wasn't letting down the British Army from 1850 onwards. No. Communication was improving, ladies and gentlemen. The electric telegraph. It made it far easier to send instant messages. First used in the Crimean War. Telegraph detachment in the Royal Engineering Corps. 24 miles. It would be easy to send messages. Communication was getting better. Also, the government back here in Britain, or officers, strategical planners back here in Britain could communicate and pass ideas on to the generals on the battlefield. Also, generals on the battlefield could contact other parts of their army. Communications was getting better. That meant that there could be bigger armies because they're easier to control and pass decisions around. Remember, I said the Battle of Waterloo, news of the victory, 1815, was brought to Britain by homing pigeon. Or once we get the telegraph, it's far easier to send and receive messages and make better decisions because the generals were better informed about what was happening. Change was coming to the British Army from 1850 to 1900. Bigger armies, transport, communications, tactics were beginning to change. But remember that point that I also said. Some things were slow to change, particularly the decline of the cavalry and the realization that full charging was no longer a really good tactic. So there we have it. We've looked at the nature of warfare in the industrial era. Our next video, ladies and gentlemen, still in the industrial era, 1700 to 1900, but this time we're going to look at the experience of war, recruitment, training, impact of war on civilians. That's coming soon. As ever, I hope it's been useful for you. All the best now. Speak to you soon.